Good evening. We have with us tonight Dave, W3DKL, who will talk to us about augmenting emergency communications with family radio, general mobile radio, and multi-use radio services, an important topic for hams and non-hams alike. Dave holds an extra class amateur radio license and has been a member of our Montgomery Amateur Radio Club since 2007. A semi-retired CPA, he served as our club treasurer for several years and is currently deputy lead on our FCC volunteer examiner team that we have proudly in our club. Dave recently was appointed an ARRL assistant manager and state government liaison for the Maryland DC section to monitor legislation related to amateur radio. A very busy man, he also serves as the treasurer for the Green Mountain Repeater Association. Dave first became interested with FRS, GMRS, and MURS radios about 20 years ago, using them to provide a communication system for his neighborhood watch team and to keep track of his kids when they were outside playing. Lately, Dave is interested in how these radio services can be integrated into emergency communications, and his near-term goal is to erect a 40-watt GMRS repeater system with a 20-mile radius of coverage. So, Dave, thanks for taking time to talk to us about this important topic. And now it's over to you.
Well, thank you, Alex, for the introduction there. Good evening to everybody out there. I hope everybody had a good, pleasant holiday here. So tonight, as Alex mentioned here, I'm going to be providing you a brief overview of three of the radio services that what I see can be, and actually probably is, integrated into many of the emergency communication systems throughout the country. In particular, I will be focusing on the family radio service, known as FRS, the general mobile radio service, known as the GMRS, and multi-use radio service, known as the MURS. Here, this is the roadmap I'm going to follow for tonight's presentation. First, I'm going to talk about in more detail for each of these three services. And then I also want to give you a high overview of ham radio and how that, relates or integrates with the use of all these other family radio services as well. I'm also going to talk to you about some of the limitations as far as using them within the CERT communications or just emergency communications in general. I'm also going to talk about the recent FCC restrictions, which now eliminate combining each of the radio services into a single radio system, equipment system. I will also follow that by providing a kind of a summary comparison of the 3 or 4 services together side by side. And I'm going to end the presentation more on a hypothetical example using primarily all these radio services in deployment to communities, if and when we do have to experience some kind of disaster and integrate the emergency communication system. But before I get into the 3 services, and I'm going to go more into detail, I want to give you a kind of like a 10,000-foot overview of amateur radio in general, and see how, and just kind of give you a view on how they work or will be interacting with the other services. Let's go back and remember back in 1912, I'm sorry, actually 1895, Marconi invented the first functional radio. And then about 17 years later, the Radio Act of 1912 was enacted into law. Shortly thereafter, amateur radio was born and licensing began at that time frame. Amateur radio is the only service that requires, as we all know, passing a written exam to obtain the license. Currently now, we have to, people who go for these exams, there's a $35 processing fee when applying for a ham license, a new ham license, or an upgrade. Compared to the FRS and GMRS and MURS radio services, ham radio has a better clarity over longer distances. And we will see that, of course, ham radio does indeed provide a vast, abundant distance capabilities for over the shorter range, like FRS radios. An important note I want to make as we move on here, and I will probably emphasize it more so in this following slides, is just because you have a ham radio license does not automatically make you eligible for transmitting on one of the family services known as the GMRS service. GMRS requires its own registration. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about that family of radios. But it doesn't prevent you from listening to transmissions on the GMRS frequencies. Now, what I'm going to do is I am first going to talk more about the GMRS radios, General Mobile Radio Service. And the approach I'm taking is I'm taking it when these services were introduced along a timeline. Of the three that I'm talking about, GMRS radio services was introduced first. Its predecessor, it's actually a I always get confused on this. It's a predecessor to the Class A Citizens Band service, which was enacted back in the late 50s, early 60s time frame. But in the 1970s, especially in the larger metropolitan areas, they were getting a lot of traffic jams on the lines of communication. And as a result, businesses were moving away from that Class A band and moving into the business radio service channels to provide a relief and allow easier access to communication for personal radio use. In 1987, GMRS was established. The most common use of GMRS channels is for short distances. It's a two-way voice communication system using handheld radios, mobile radios, and repeater systems. And I'll talk a little bit more later about repeater systems related to GMRS. It is a licensed radio service that uses channels around the 462 megahertz range and the 467 megahertz range. Licensing cost today currently is now $35 for a 10-year period, but no written exam is required. Sharing you with my experiences, I got my first GMRS license back in 1988, and I believe it was about $85 or $95. So it has dropped more recently. Past 5 years, it's dropped down to $35. As I mentioned, referenced before, the Class A Citizen Radio Service used frequency modulation with a plus or minus 15 kilohertz transmitter deviation, and the spacing between each of the channels was 50 kilohertz. Now, today in the GMRS services, this deviation is, the bandwidth is plus or minus 6.25 kilohertz on that one frequency channel. And the spacing between each channel is now down to 25 kilohertz. Business users are still permitted to get licensed for this radio service. So you can do personal as well as business communications on this service. When you get issued a call sign, the call sign is totally different from that of ham radio. You have 4 letters, alpha letters, followed by 3 numerals. I don't know if anybody captured at the beginning of the briefing here. My call is WQWD 872 in the GMRS frequency range. Now, something else that happened more recently in 2017, the FCC expanded the GMRS services now to include text messaging as well as GPS location services as well. On this slide here, what we're seeing here is that only individuals that have a valid GMRS license and their immediate families, and you can see there how they define immediate families, can use the GMRS frequencies. So if I have a call, so anybody in my immediate family can be talking on the frequency without having to have a license. And they don't have to be like within my vicinity. If they're, like a few miles away, they can call me without having to have a license because they are part of my immediate family there. The only other difference is station identification is still required. However, you do not have to identify your station at the beginning of a communication, but you do have to make the identification every 15 minutes and at the end of the transmission. Some other capabilities that you have or characteristics we have of this. And right now, there are a maximum of 30 channels presently. But in the earlier days, we had a total of about, I think it was 14, and then eventually expanded to 22 frequency channels. 15 of those channels, channels 1 through 7 and 15 to 22, are dedicated to GMRS. Again, these radios use FM modulation. And of course, we know that from our experiences, FM gives us a more quiet and clear communication between multiple parties. Now, with GMRS, we are limited to 1 to 5 watts of power. Again, on those dedicated channels that I mentioned. However, if you have a base station, as noted below there, they can have power level all the way up to 50 watts. And more than likely, they're going to be using the repeaters that exist in many cases when they're upping their power to that level of power. And as I see there, mentioned there, the other point I want to make is removable antennas. You can have removable antennas on the GMRS radios. Most other radios that I will talk about, you cannot remove the antennas. You are stuck with the antenna that came with that equipment system. Some manufacturers will also include NOAA channels on the radios just to give you that capability. That's probably the only other service communication that you can merge today, whether it be a MURS radio, an FRS radio, or a GMRS radio. One thing, before I go on to the next slide, one thing I'd like to note is I have pictures there, picture of a mobile repeater. As Alex mentioned, I'm kind of experimenting with the repeaters now. And I've actually just purchased this mobile repeater. It's about a $400 item. Maximum power outage, though, is limited to 10 watts. And I haven't really got it all together yet, fixed. But with the 10 watts, I mean, the range can probably go up to about 10 to 12 miles at best, if we had a clear line of sight and distances nearby here. Just kind of give you an idea on some prices, and we'll talk more about that later too. This slide here is depicting the frequencies for GMRS and FRS, which I will talk to shortly. It gives you a breakout by each of the two services and the maximum power output that can be done for each channel. One thing I want to note, though, is channels 8 through 14 are actually FRS frequencies, and they are limited to a ½ watt of output power. Recently, FCC increased the output power to 2 watts, but they kept the half a power wattage on channels 8 through 9 there. They did not allow for an increase in power there. You'll also note on this slide here, there are a total of 30 channels. The channels 20, is it the, I always get confused. Channel 15 through 30 are really repeater frequency output, channels. 15 to 22 are is the output, and the other remaining ones, 23 through 30, are the repeater input frequencies. Talking about repeaters, one point I want to mention right at the start, repeaters can be used for GMRS family radio services, but they cannot be used for FRS or MURS radios. More, I will have an aside on MURS a little bit later here. This chart provides a listing of the current GMRS repeaters that are in the state of Maryland. I did kind of a geographical look at these and noticed that, like east of Bethesda, where I'm located, we are covered with repeaters all the way to the eastern seaboard. What is not covered is primarily areas north of Bethesda all the way up to Pennsylvania and out west to the Panhandle. There is not a single GMRS repeater system. And the other point I want to make on this is, unlike ham radio, at least in our region, we have the TMARC. There is no repeater council to coordinate repeaters and their frequencies of use in the area. So it's up to the individuals who want to create a repeater system to go ahead and coordinate on their own and make sure they have a frequency picked that's going to be unique to that area of coverage. There we go. So we're going to go on to talk more a bit about the Family Radio Services, FRS. Again, this is a private this allows for private two-way short distance voice and data communication services by facilitating family and group activities. The FRS uses the same frequency range as you saw before and channels as the GMRS service does, but again, operates on a lower power and do not require FCC licenses. Unlike GMRS, you need a license to use the higher power. In essence, that's what they're giving you there. FRS has also been seen to be or has significantly adopted its, let me rephrase that. Businesses have really adopted these radios because, again, you don't need a license. It's a low-cost alternative for running their business operations versus using the business band. It's just another alternative that they'd like to consider. Again, I mean, it's going to be a very close proximity communication because with the FRS, the range, because of the low power, the range is rather limited. At best, you might be able to go out to a half a mile to a mile with an FRS radio. The other thing I want to note here, FRS radios were introduced back in 1996. And as Alex mentioned, I was already using GMRS radios prior to 1996, but again, when my kids were little, it was very easy to start tracking them when they were, in the early, like age 8 or 9, to giving them the radio. And so when they go out and play with their buddies or go to next door or whatever, at least we had a way to communicate with them and just keep track of where everybody is. I got my community where I live involved and introduced, had a neighborhood watch system established, and we just started it with the FRS radios. This way, we didn't have to use GMRS radios where you needed a license. And many of my neighbors are, I think, not technically savvy, and just wanted something very simple for communications for the neighborhood watch program. This slide here, as I mentioned, the range of the FRS radios is limited because of the low power. As I mentioned, the average range is about a mile or less. But after, and you only could use the first 14 channels that I mentioned before. But after 2017, the FCC allowed the FRS community radios to use the channels from 15 to 22, and because again, those were the frequencies where it was the output frequencies for repeaters. It would allow someone with an FRS radio to at least listen to communication coming from a repeater, but they didn't have the capability to talk into the repeater because they just didn't have the power, and it's just not permitted by the FCC as well, at the higher power rating at least. I mentioned that before. And the picture that you just saw there was my rack of 6 radios that I used, for my immediate family moving forward. Prior to September 2017, the FCC allowed the production of hybrid radios. Now, these were radios in which the GMRS and FRS services capabilities were integrated and certified into a single radio. They were very popular and still are popular, but it was allowed by the FCC until 2017. One of the problems that FCC was noting is that people who did not have the GMRS license, but were using their radios for FRS purposes only, were, found to be talking on the other frequency band channels at times where you needed a GMRS license, as well as the power levels. These radios were structured in such a way that when you moved from channel to channel, you could actually adjust the power level. So it made it very cumbersome for people to keep track of what they could or could not do, especially those without a license. So to circumvent this problem, in 2017, the FCC implemented new regulations that would allow the following results. Hybrid radios can no longer be manufactured, and in particular, since most of these radios were manufactured offshore, like from China or Japan, made it not allowable to import radios of that type from China or Japan. And I think even India was involved there too. Radios can only now be certified either as an FRS only, a GMRS only, and when I'll talk to further, MURS radios only. And FRS radios can now operate on the previously GMRS channels 1522. Again, that's really just like I mentioned before, they can literally hear what's going on from the repeaters itself. And as I said, also mentioned earlier, the power output for FRS limits have been increased to 2 watts per channel, excluding channels 8 through 14. Another thing I want to note, and you may have noticed it on the top of each of the slides here, Um, for FRS, GMRS, and MURS, they are all controlled by 47 CFR Part 95, and each one of those services has a subpart of Part 95, totally dedicated and written for that one service. Unlike ham radio, which is a different part of 47 CFR. So I'd like to turn my attention to MURS radios. The MURS service was introduced in the year 2000, and again, as I mentioned, is governed by 47 CFR, Part 95, Subpart J. MURS, multi-use radio service, is authorized only 5 channels that were previously in the industrial business radio service, and were known as what was back then color dot channels or frequencies in the Part 90 of the FCC rules at that point in time. You do not require a license. Makes a good another good candidate for like CERT team activities. It can be used for personal and business activities even of a public nature, but it cannot be connected to a telephone network. You can use voice or data communication services as well. On the next slide here, I'm giving you the 5 frequencies in which MURS is. So we're in the 151 and the 154 frequency range. As you see there, the MURS channels 1 through 3 are in the 151 range, and 4 and 5, these are back from some of the business days, business services. We kept the blue dot and the green dot frequencies that you see there. And again, the bandwidth, you can see there, 20 kilohertz for channels 4 and 5, and 11.25 kilohertz for the channels 1 through 3. Some other characteristics of MURS radios is, again, one thing I mentioned before, you cannot have repeaters, but I'll talk about that shortly. There's some exceptions to that. So some limits you have are, or characteristics is, these MURS radios have because of the lower frequency and the power level can be up as high as 2 watts or so, you have an extended range compared to that of FRS, definitely. GMRS, maybe, but some of these GMRS radios they're making today can have ranges up to about 30 miles, I've been told. There is an antenna height restriction. As you see there, it cannot be no more than 60 feet above ground unless it is attached to a structure, a building. Then you have the limitation of no more than 20 feet from the highest point of that structure. As I mentioned, generally speaking, the repeaters are not allowed. And actually, I covered this, I checked on this just 2 days ago. There is a however. There are some grandfathered business users on these frequencies. They were there long before the MURS radio was created. Because of that, they get to stay, they still get to use and keep those repeaters as long as they maintain their license. If their license should lapse somewhere, they lose that function, and they would have to dismantle, that repeater system. That is the only exception. That would also be true if some repeaters were generated for the other services, and then the capabilities are no longer available. FCC has always provided some kind of grandfather clause in many of these radio services. So let me switch over to certain how these radios can be worked together. FRS and GMRS radios are common among a lot of CERT teams across the country here. GMRS radios are used, but if you are going to use GMRS radios for a CERT activity or some kind of emergency communication program, you got to make sure that whoever is assigned to those duties, that they have the proper licensing for GMRS radios. Because remember, the license is very strict, only family, immediate family members. So that does not apply to a CERT team. I mean, John Doe over here and Jane over here, because they're not immediately family members, you can't just, you can't mix that together. You got to have your own license there. MURS radios are kind of on the increase. It is being used by the CERT teams, but it's still not that popular among most CERT teams nationally. Again, I mean, as a side note, I mean, there are some pros and cons between the FRS and the MURS systems, but it's going to have to be up to the MURS team or emergency communications team to determine which radio service they really want to do. There are some pros and cons. It's just a matter of evaluating how they're going to use that CERT team out there in the field. So that's one of many factors that has to be considered. As I mentioned, the CERT teams are using FRS and GMRS radios predominantly, besides ham radios. FRS radios are useful for assigning to individuals and or computer. This is an example I'm going to be talking about a little bit later here. There is a increased interest in assigning FRS, GMRS radios or MURS radios to communities when you are doing emergency communications drills. But more, I'll talk about that more towards the end here. It requires some kind of inventory management system of the radios to implement when assigning these radios to the community to make it easier for identifying who's calling the emergency communication team. Excuse me here. Let's kind of give you a general idea of integrating ham radio with FRS and GMRS and MURS frequencies. We all know that ham radio can be used at all levels of the emergency or incident command structure. Whether it's at the EOCs, the CERT teams, local government levels, and even hospitals or other medical units out there in the field. However, we got to keep in mind that ham radio does have its limitations when we integrate it into this whole communication network involving the FRS and GMRS radios. Assuming ham radio can receive, some of these ham radios don't work or monitor the frequencies that FRS, GMRS, and MURS are on, but there are some ham radios that might have that capability that you can at least listen to those frequencies. But that's all you can do, because if you can't talk on those frequencies, because first of all, we have our limitations as ham radio amateurs as well on what we can do. And we're restricted to certain frequency bands too. But we can listen and, early have like an early warning system on if somebody's got a problem out there, then we can start some activity moving forward, like especially if we're at the EOC, we can start some activity to follow up on resolving whatever the issue may be out there in the field. But regardless, if you're going to be monitoring using your ham radio, you better have a certified FRS or MURS radio, or have your license in the GMRS radio to use it in that case. You know, that's about all I can say at this point in time on that. A lot of fine print on this slide. I'm going to summarize it this way. The takeaway from this slide is that in more recent years, the FCC has placed a more restrictive language in the regulations to avoid the overlap in the FRS, GMRS, and MURS and other radio services, such as amateur radio. What the regulations are doing is they want to make sure that the radios are simplified and to make it easy for a non-technical person to use that radio. Again, the radios can only be certified for that particular radio service. They cannot be, hybrid radios are no longer allowed to be manufactured. Radios are locked to their intended frequencies as well as the power requirements for that service. The big takeaway, though, is it prevents people from transmitting on frequencies that require licensing. And you can see there in the right box, the farthest right box, give you an example. I mean, just imagine if somebody was on the FRS radios and they had a channel 30 and they could transmit on one of our ham radio frequencies, 146.52 here. I mean, just imagine the chaos or just the, would have like an unruly number of unlicensed operators working on the 2-meter band. So the FCC, foresaw this and said, did what they did. They actually had to write up some restrictive language so nothing like this could ever happen in the future. This chart here kind of provides us a summary of each of the radio services. So I've got each of the services, FRS, GMRS, MURS radios, and ham radio in a side-by-side comparison. So I have capabilities, each column represents some kind of capability or characteristic. And so you can see, how they compare when they were first introduced into the service. So again, FRS came in 1996. GMRS came in much earlier, MURS at 2000. Then, of course, ham radio came back in about the 1912 area. I'm not going to go through the whole list there. One thing I did not put on this slide here, if you have questions on like price ranges for each of these radios, for FRS radios, I'm keeping it simple here. I've seen price ranges between $40 to $80, and I'm talking about for one radio. Sometimes you might get these best deals where you buy two for almost the price of one. GMRS radios, range anywhere from about $70 to $90 or $100 per radio. Again, it's a function of what other features may be on that radio, like NOAA and other little frequency or perks that don't interfere with the radio services. Now, in the MURS, can range from $69 to about $110 also. I've actually seen MURS HT radios go for several hundreds of dollars. And of course, when we're talking about ham radio, we have a big range gap there between one of the Waxon or Chinese, Japanese made radios going from about $50 all the way up to like a Yaesu or an ICOM costing anywhere between $350 to $500 or $600. Just kind of give you an idea on the price ranges here. One other thing I want to cover is this slide here kind of gives you an idea of the correlation, between the output power and the range of coverage. Again, we know that if we were on really an open area, no obstructions, we know that there is a strong correlation between, as we have an increase in power, we should expect to see an increase in the communication range. I'm going to use that term loosely. What I mean by communication, I really mean the range in which we can transmit. Communication works both ways, receiving and sending. One thing I failed to mention in any of these slides here is the use of CTCSS. In many cases, you can do that if the radio is, programmed to do that. But CTCSS, it can be introduced and selected for any of those conversations you want to have to be maybe slightly more on a private scale moving forward. I'm going to end this presentation with a simple hypothetical deployment example for FRS, GMRS, and really FRS and MURS radios. I'm going to focus on GMRS because there is a licensing requirement for that. And this example, if you look at the left-hand column, is this example kind of mimics the principles of the medical alert system. Let's just suppose if we had an inventory of these radios, that CERT team, as they're going out, doing their job, if they have extra radios, they could literally hand them out. Like for instance, they cannot service a group or people, but they're going to leave them a radio so that maybe when they come back, or somebody else can come out and retrieve them and take care of them. You have the capability of deploying these radios so that when the individual or the citizen that is going to use that at a later point in time, when they call on that frequency, whoever is monitoring that radio almost instantaneously knows who it is. And in order to do that, I've kind of put a list out there of what needs to be done to make sure that capability exists or happens. It requires you to have like an inventory, and you have to be able to label each of the radios with a unique ID. And maybe depending on how the size of the community you're dealing with, you might be limiting them to a particular channel. If not, then of course they can select their own channel, but the identification of that radio would be sufficient as long as you have a good recorder of who's recording. Here's the radio, number 13. I'm giving it to Jane Doe in apartment B of this high rise, and her phone number is, just in case, and keep that inventory, and then could be relayed back at a central location so that if a communication does happen, you know immediately where to go to help that individual out. It could work with any radio besides those. It could be working with GMRS, but again, the individual has to have a license in that case there. With that, I think I'm done, unless there are any questions. On this last slide here, I do identify a few resources, links that you can go to, and I will try to make this available to everybody and make those links functional when I provide this as a PDF file. That's all I have.
Well, thanks, Dave, for a really informative and detailed presentation. A lot of good information for people that want to pursue this particular kind of capability. So we do have a question from Hank. Hank, over to you.
Well, not just a question, but 4
Uh-oh.
questions, and
Uh-oh.
I'll take them in the order of the presentation. At one point, Dave, you mentioned, or you had on your slide, that unlicensed repeater owners in the GMRS band were permitted. Can you elucidate?
Okay, so you don't have to have a license to, create and own a GMRS repeater. This goes back to a suggestion I was going to make to the club too. First of all, I'm creating my own repeater at my home site. Now, for about a $1,200 to $1,500 investment, I mean, the radio club, if we wanted to create a GMRS repeater for Mark to work with all of its the ham radio antenna as well, you don't have to be licensed as a GMRS individual. You can just put one up. The only licensing requirement is required when you're operating a radio and transmitting.
Okay, so I guess that indicates that an unlicensed repeater on GMRS does not have an ID typical of, public safety or ham radio of that sort. Well, for my second question is on one of the slides when we're talking about CERT teams and whatnot, you said, practice on FRS frequencies 11, 14, or, 8 through 14. Why not on 1 through 7? What's the reason?
I have to find that slide. Well, repeat that question one last time.
Okay. On your CERT team information for the various radios, you had on the FRS sector, it said practice FRS on channels 8 through 14 only, not 1 through 7.
Well, because even though you can do FRS on the other 1 through 7, 8 through 14 is definitely FRS only.
I see. So you wouldn't have a co-channel or a co-service interference with GMRS or something of that sort.
So what happens, I'll talk more about the hybrid radio. The hybrid radio, when you go onto those channels, those radios definitely do an immediate step down to 0.5 watt, which is in the FRS range. But if you are in the 1 through 7, if you have a GMRS radio, you can have as much as 5 watts of output power. But FRS only allows up to 2 watts.
Okay.
But if you're doing 1 through 7, to eliminate the risk of violating the GMRS rules, it's better just to practice in the 8 through 14, because we know definitely it will always be 0.5 watt of output power.
Okay. And then
that way you're not dealing with licensing requirements.
Okay. And then my third and next to last question, there was a mention of FMZ, that is Frank Mike Zebra Communications. I didn't understand what that was about. I think that was in reference to EOC comms with amateur radios.
If I mentioned FMZ, something that might be a typo on something. Can you refer to the slide? I'm looking for it.
Unfortunately, I failed to put down the slide numbers.
But it was
where you were talking about the various functional operations of the GMRS and FRS and ham radio, and I guess a deployment.
Yeah, I don't remember that offhand. I'm looking at
okay, well, we can come back to it later. And then my last question is, you mentioned these deployment systems using for the CERT teams, that it was similar in to the medical alert system. I'm not familiar with that. Can you?
Well, I mean, if you ever seen these commercials where, somebody, presses a button on their chin, or they got something around their neck, medical alert system, they press the button and somebody answers, says, "Help, I'm fallen, I need help." I mean, it's kind of a similar way where if an individual had that communication capability with a radio, they could just call on the channel and say, "Help, I'm trapped in my elevator. The apartment complex manager, is not around," or whatever. And again, this is like during like an emergency communication, drill or a live system. The individual who's monitoring will know immediately, oh, this is, if she's got to give her ID of her radio. He will then know, oh, that's Mary Quackenbush, and she's at apartment B in complex whatever. That's kind of, that's
Okay,
kind of what I'm
well,
talking about.
thank you for the explanations. Appreciate it very much on an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hank. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, the volunteer fire department has had some experience with this. There was a movement to use it for citizen emergency preparedness. But in reviewing it, we came to the conclusion that we, and perhaps uniquely, were in a bad spot if we used it, because it might create an expectation of service that we couldn't provide, such as continuous monitoring. And we didn't want that to get stuck in people's heads. Now, that wouldn't be a problem for the club or anybody else. And the other thing I wanted to share is that there is a GMRS repeater that is publicly available, that is on or at the same site as the MARC repeater. It's of course operated by somebody else, but it is an open repeater. So, if there's a need for it, it can be made available, and its operators are very open to that. So just, a couple of things that you might want to know.
Yeah, I did, when I was doing some research on MURS, I did find that in some areas, like the police department, or more so the fire departments, were looking at the MURS radios as a possibility of use, but I didn't get further into it before this presentation.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Jean?
Yeah, Tom, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I have a couple of questions if there's time. Is there a height restriction for GMRS, either base station antennas or repeater antennas?
I think, I don't know what the specific regs are on. I mean, I could research that and get back to you on that.
Don't waste your time. I mean, I can look it up myself then if in part 95. Can other licensees use my repeater? And to generalize, can different licensees with different call signs talk to each other on GMRS frequencies?
If they have GMRS licensees, yeah,
Yes.
they can talk through the repeater. And again, it's channels, channel 23 through 30 is the output channel for the repeaters. And then channels 15 through 22 are the input frequencies to the repeaters.
Okay, no, I mean, let's say simplex, UHF simplex channels on GMRS. Can one licensee talk to a different licensee?
Via simplex, yes.
Okay.
You don't have to go through a repeater.
Okay, and as I think I know the answer to this question, since you said you do not have to have a license to set up a repeater, but is the repeater owner responsible for the content of the traffic passed through the repeater?
I haven't seen language like that. I mean, there's a common etiquette, just like we have in the ham radio community. Keep the language simple. Of course, we can talk business on these frequencies, excluding, ham radio. I haven't seen much along that. It's just, you can put a repeater up, and remember, this is open network unless you keep it, closed network. You can create a repeater that's closed network. And if it's among family members, I mean, technically, I mean, I would think, everybody should be on their, straight and narrow here, because, you got to be aware that anybody can hear your conversation.
Okay, yeah, I was more or less worried if I decided to put up a repeater on my tower, for example, a GMRS repeater on my tower, would I have to worry what my non-ham neighbors were saying over that repeater? And I guess the answer is no, it's their problem.
No, true. Now, the other thing you got to be careful of, you mentioned a tower. Depending on where you are, like in Montgomery County, I know the term structure and tower have two different meanings.
Yeah, okay, so
Structure means
the
building,
structure if I put it on the structure in my backyard.
and I'm not sure what the requirements are with the GMRS radios. I think they've always focused on structure and not tower.
Okay,
in their definitions, so that when I talked about the MURS antenna requirements, 60 feet above ground or 20 feet above the highest
right.
structure, I'm not sure what that limit is offhand with GMRS. I used to know it.
Okay, again, I don't want to waste everybody's
I think
time.
I think it was still 60 feet or 20 feet also, but I would have to double check that.
Okay, all right, I could do that myself, but thank you anyway for your time. I'm done.
Thanks, Gene. David?
Yes.
Oh, W2LNX.
Other Dave.
The other
Other
David.
All
Hi,
right,
Dave.
there's David and Dave.
Yeah, hi, boss.
Yeah. So, basic question: Can you talk to the data communications capabilities of MURS? I looked it up and I couldn't get an answer. So, what's involved?
All I know is I've kind of echoed what I saw, in some of the regs, but I'm not sure what they're talking. I mean, what data communications means in MURS. I know that on a similar frequency, when the business, I mean, my father had a business years ago, back in the 60s. So when we were looking at the 154 frequency range there, that's what, one of his services was doing in that area there. And we were able to transfer some simple data over the network, but I'm trying to remember what my father was doing at the time. He was transmitting, it's more like we were doing faxes somehow. I'm almost sure faxes were done, but I'm sure it's changed a lot since then. Other than that, I really can't answer the question. I didn't have time to do any research on that area of the MURS radio.
Okay. All right. Fred, over to you.
Yeah, just in sort of in response to Tom, I'm not sure if Tom was referring to Dick Heyman WN3R's GMRS repeater, but that does not exist in Rockville anymore. If that's what he was referring to, it does not exist.
Yeah, it's the
No, it's a different operator.
Okay.
I've seen on some of the GMRS repeaters that some of them associate their ham radio license with that repeater, as far as referencing it, but I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a no-no according to the FCC. I haven't seen anything related to that.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Fred. Any more questions? All right. Terrific presentation, David. Thank you. A whole lot of information, a whole lot of interest. So I think that's oh, Fred, did you just ask another? Oh, you're applauding. I'm getting the difference.
I'll give myself away.
Okay, all right, great. Well, thanks again. And thank you to everyone who participated tonight. Truly appreciate all of your great support. So what we're going to do now is adjourn the meeting. And if you wanted to stay and discuss things more, anybody have an interest in a meeting after the meeting? Okay, Tom, you had one last question?
No, actually an announcement.
Yeah.
For new techs who may have only a portable, for instance, we do have among several of us a cache of mobile radios that could be used as base stations and can help anybody who wants to get set up with a base station or even a mobile. I'm not saying hundreds or even 50, but several. So if somebody wants a base station or a mobile radio and doesn't have the means or just can't put that money in that place right now, they should get in touch with myself or David, and we can come up with something for them. So just so people know.
I'm glad you brought that up, Tom, because I know we have some people with an interest in amateur radio that are with us tonight. We have a loaning program. Yes, we loan equipment for nothing. So just to help you, we have mentors. David is great as a mentor. Tom is great as a mentor. We've got lots of people that are eager to help. Contact, I would contact, if you go on our website, there's an education link and it'll go right to David W2 LNX. He will mentor you. He will loan you the equipment for as long as you need it, so you can familiarize yourself with it, see if you like it. Don't commit to buying until you try to, figure out if it's for you, because it's not for everybody. It sounds great, and some people love it, and right away, but we have a no risk policy. We don't want you to spend the money. Our education classes are free. We give exams, those are free. And if we're not doing the exam or the education class, Laurel does great. If you go on the ARRL website and you want to find a class or find a club, it's all in there. And there's lots of great resources in the area. But please turn to us for the loaning of free equipment, because we are very happy to help. All right. Okay. One last question from Joe. Maybe Joe, I think Joe is probably applauding too. Yes.
Alex, one last question. I just want to do a shout out.
Hang on a moment. Okay.
I want to do a shout out, even though my brother can't hear me. He's down in South Carolina. I've only been convincing him to get his ham radio license for about 15 years. He just passed the exam.
Congratulations.
And his call is KQ4TGD, I think it is. Great. But he said he wanted to work on high frequency. I said, well, you're going to have to pass the general now. So,
all right, Joe, one last comment.
Yes, I just wanted to, because of the last topic of the club's willingness to loan equipment, on Mondays, Green Mountain's eyeball QSO party, a lady is looking for a radio to help give one of her children. I don't know much more about that, but if she participates in this coming Monday's eyeball QSO party, I'll let her know to get in touch with either you or Tom.
Okay, Joe, let me stop you right there.
Okay.
When we loan equipment, it's not just to anybody. It's to people that are in our club or interested in amateur radio that we help. So it's within our
Right.
community, because we only have a limited amount of equipment. And
Oh,
it's-
sure.
Yeah, so it's not for
Um,
people that aren't related to us, because we just don't have that much to give. We would love to help everybody.
Right. This might be a way to acquire a new member, but would could could, I'll if the opportunity comes on Monday, I might mention it
Okay, good. Yeah, if she has an interest in our
and just
club,
yeah, and I'll make her aware that it's a requirement.
it's not, it's a tiny string attached. I wouldn't call it a
Yeah,
requirement. It's a
wow,
little harsh. It's like a
okay.
little tiny string. You have to, our club is full of really wonderful people, and everybody has a heart of gold, like you, Joe.
Thank you.
Reaching out to this woman, who has a child, and Dave W2LNX loves working with children. He has a lot of
Okay.
middle schoolers that have their license.
Mhm.
And so if she wants to, we would gladly embrace her and her child and help them any way we can. How's that?
That's wonderful. We've got one of the best clubs in the area.
Thank you. I think so too. Thank you. We have the best members, that's for sure.
An extension on the radio thing, and I'll keep it short. If you're thinking of trying a new antenna,
Mhm.
but you're not sure that you want to go all in, we have a vast array of antenna equipment stored away. Anything that somebody might be thinking of trying for a new effort, and happy to loan that stuff out so that you could try the antenna for a period. And then if you discovered you didn't like it, you're not several $100s into the deal. You only borrowed it. So
Right.
keep that in mind too. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Quick question for David, the presenter, his brother's call sign again.
I'm not sure exactly. I know that it's the KQ4 Tango. That much I know. If you look up Daryl Williams,